One of the most important choices a wannabe president can make is his choice of running mate. These individuals not only have the chance to work under the next president of the United States, but also could be one step away from becoming the so-called leader of the free world. Whether due to their experience, living in a state of great regional importance, or being similar, if not a contrast to the nominee themselves, VPs usually stay loyal to the presidents they serve. However, the same can't be said about presidents sticking with their vice presidents. The following are 10 occasions in which the VP was replaced by someone else, with the reasons as to why varying in quality. These are the 10 times vice presidents got replaced. Aaron Burr. The first VP on our list is a man you might know, thanks to a successful play which chronicles the political life and death of the man Aaron Burr murdered in a duel. The events that led to that infamous duel could be traced all the way back to the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were tied in the Electoral College and the House of Representatives had to determine the winner. Thanks to Alexander Hamilton's well-known habit of meddling in political affairs, the House voted for Jefferson to be the third U.S. president, while Burr would become the third vice president. Due to Jefferson never really trusting Burr to begin with, and the fact that Hamilton interfered in Burr's attempts to become governor of New York in 1804 resulted in the duel that claimed Hamilton's life and led to Jefferson dropping Burr off the ticket come the next election. Former governor of New York George Clinton was selected as Jefferson's new running mate, with the pair easily winning the 1804 election in a landslide. Burr, on the other hand, would be arrested and put on trial for killing Hamilton, but the charges were dropped. A failed attempt to capture Spanish-controlled Florida further led to infamy, and Burr's legacy still remains tarnished. John Calhoun. Going into the 1824 election, Calhoun was one of several names running for the top job when he began to realize his chances were slim and far between. Calhoun instead became the vice president, where he served under John Quincy Adams, who had won the presidency by way of the House of Representatives. By 1828, Calhoun resigned from his VP spot and joined forces with Andrew Jackson, leading to Calhoun becoming vice president again. Problems would emerge once more between VP and president, which ended with Calhoun leaving his position for a second time, and by 1832, New York Democrat Martin Van Buren became Jackson's new running mate and before long the new vice president. For more information on Calhoun's time as vice president, check this video we made some time ago on the channel. Hannibal Hamlin. A former Democrat who served as a representative and senator from Maine, Hamlin soon defected to the Republican Party due to his ardent anti-slavery views. In 1860, Hannibal won the VP nomination on the second ballot by defeating former Kentucky State Representative and absolute badass, Cassius Marcellus Clay. Hamlin would also be added to the ticket for regional balance, with presidential nominee Abraham Lincoln guaranteed to secure the Midwestern states, as he served as U.S. Representative for Illinois prior to this election. While Lincoln is hailed today as one of America's greatest presidents, the same could not be said for Hamlin's time as vice president, with the man himself often maligning his role as he felt neglected by the Lincoln administration. Historian and author Edward A. Purcell notes how Hannibal had no significant role to play during the Civil War. It's due to this lack of responsibilities as VP that allows Hamlin to serve in Maine's Coast Guard Division, where he was promoted to corporal and spent much of his time guarding buildings and peeling potatoes. By time of the 1864 election, America was still smack bang into the Civil War, and Hamlin was given the boot. In his place on the ticket would be the military governor of Tennessee and Democrat Andrew Johnson. This was done by Lincoln to broaden his support with Democrats who were against the continuation of the war, although it's reported that Major Union Army General Benjamin Butler was also considered for this role. Under the newly found and short-lived National Unity Party, Lincoln and Johnson would win the 1864 election, and soon afterward the war came to a close. As for Hamlin himself, the New York Herald noted he left the office thoroughly disgusted with everything and almost everyone in public life. So not exactly the best way to end a political career. Thankfully for Hamlin, he would return to public life, where he served 2 more terms as senator and became the ambassador to Spain under the Garfield administration. Schuyler Colfax. One of 2 speakers of the House to become vice president, Schuyler Colfax was nominated on the 6th ballot due in part to his skills as an orator and his political experience. In 1868, the Republican Party nominated Colfax to be the running mate for Civil War hero Ulysses S. Grant, leading to the Indiana native becoming the 17th vice president. Despite his role in getting the 13th Amendment passed and having a good congressional career, Colfax surprisingly was unable to redefine the role of vice president like many others would do after him. Halfway through his tenure in 1870, Colfax announced his plans to step down after Grant's term was completed, but not because he had little interest in remaining the VP. Rather, Colfax had believed that Grant wouldn't run for a second term, and as such he decided to make his own bid for the presidency. However, this plan backfired when Grant made it clear he would indeed run for a second term in 1872, leaving Colfax to make a last-ditch effort to keep his job. By then, it was too little too late, as the nomination was clinched by Massachusetts Senator Henry Wilson with 399.5 delegate votes to Colfax's 308.5 delegate votes. Scrutiny soon fell on both Colfax and Wilson as they were caught up in the credit mobilier scandal, in which bribes were given to high-ranking officials by the Union Pacific Railroad during the building of the first transcontinental railway. Although Wilson's involvement in the scandal was minimal, Colfax was very much connected and as such became damaged goods for the GOP. The Grant/Wilson ticket easily won the 1872 election, with the biggest highlight of Wilson's tenure as VP would be his tie-breaking vote in favor of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, as Wilson was a longtime supporter of fighting slavery. Levi Morton. As former Congressman of New York and later U.S. Ambassador to France, Levi Morton was in a prime position to be the running mate for presidential nominee and Indiana Senator Benjamin Harrison. Thanks to the political sway of Thomas C. Platt, a New York party boss who would later help Theodore Roosevelt become VP, Morton would become the running mate on the first ballot, with the pair narrowly defeating incumbent President Grover Cleveland in 1888. Similar to Schuyler Colfax, Morton's time as vice president was pretty uneventful, with the sole highlight being the fight to pass the Lodge Bill, which would have granted voting rights to African Americans living in the Deep South. With the votes both for and against the bill being razor-thin, Morton, as Senate president, had to make the tie-breaking vote, but the bill didn't pass due to Morton's refusal to help his fellow Republicans. Harrison soon blamed Morton for the bill failing to get through, which resulted in Levi being kicked off the ticket in 1892 with New York Tribune editor Whitelaw Reid as the new running mate. It didn't help though, as Cleveland would go on to recapture the White House upon winning the election. Following this, Levi would successfully run for governor of New York in 1894, and made efforts to reduce patronage by enacting civil service reform. By 1896, Morton decided to run for the GOP's presidential nomination and then later the VP spot, only to lose both to William McKinley and Garrett Hobart respectively. James Sherman. As a member of the GOP's conservative wing, James Schoolcraft Sherman was liked by many influential figures and deemed acceptable by the party's progressive wing. So come the 1908 election, Sherman was chosen to be on the ticket after winning 816 delegate votes on the first ballot. Sherman would be the running mate for William Howard Taft, who easily secured the party's nomination for president mainly thanks to President and good friend Theodore Roosevelt persuading him and others in the convention hall to do so. After winning the election, Taft initially wanted Sherman to be his liaison when it came to dealing with the conservatives in the party, but Sherman refused, believing that his duties as VP doesn't include him being the president's personal messenger. By the time Taft ran for re-election in 1912, Sherman's health was rapidly declining thanks to a kidney ailment known as Bright's disease. Despite his best efforts in being renominated as VP, Sherman would succumb to the disease on October 30th, mere days before the election. This forced the GOP to put Nicholas Butler, the president of Columbia University, as Taft's new running mate, but it proved to be in vain as Taft was soundly defeated come Election Day. John Nance Garner. As the then Speaker of the House, Texas native John Nance Garner, nicknamed Cactus Jack, looked poised to become the Democratic Party's nominee for president come the 1932 Democratic Convention. By the third ballot, Garner, along with Al Smith, the 1928 presidential candidate, and Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York, were in the triple-digit delegate count. Although FDR had well over 50% of the votes, he was nearly 100 votes short of the two-thirds majority. In order for FDR to secure the votes needed to win, Garner withdrew his candidacy, which opened the door for him to become Roosevelt's running mate. Following their landslide victory in 1932, Garner became the second Speaker of the House turned vice president after the aforementioned Colfax. Although he's famous for saying that vice presidency was not worth a pitcher of warm piss, the Dolph Biscoe Center for American History claimed that stated Garner transformed what had been a largely ceremonial office into an influential executive and legislative position. He worked closely alongside Roosevelt in cabinet meetings and was responsible for pushing through much of Roosevelt's New Deal agenda. After winning the 1936 election in another landslide, the relationship between FDR and Cactus Jack began to break down. As a conservative from the Lone Star State, Garner labeled some of the New Deal policies as damn foolishness, in particular the wealth tax and Social Security measures. Garner was also against the Union-strengthening Wagner Act, and he was one of several critics over FDR's attempts at packing the Supreme Court. When it became clear that Roosevelt was going to run for an unprecedented third term, Garner opposed this and in 1939 announced his plans to run for president come the next election. A Gallup poll conducted at the time suggests that Garner was the favorite to win had Roosevelt not stood for another term. By time the Democratic Convention of 1940 came to a close, FDR crushed Garner with a delegate vote count of 946 to Garner's 61. With Cactus Jack no longer a part of the presidential ticket, a new running mate needed to be selected for Roosevelt. And who was that new running mate, you ask? That would be Henry Wallace. Roosevelt's new vice president was far more liberal than Cactus Jack, and he wasn't wildly loved by party bosses, which is understandable as Wallace had previously been a member of the Republican Party until 1936. Following his switch to the Democrats, Wallace worked as the Secretary of Agriculture, where he oversaw the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, with author Patricia Sullivan noting he presided over what was arguably the most ambitious, innovative, and successful New Deal program. Roosevelt made it clear that he would refuse his party's nomination had Wallace not been given the role of the VP due to the latter's overwhelming support of the president. At the convention, FDR's wife Eleanor gave a speech to convince delegates to go with Wallace, which he won with a 626 to 330 delegate vote count. Wallace's time as VP saw him lead the Board of Economic Warfare and the Supply Priorities and Allocations Board, both of which were responsible in the mobilization of supplies for America's involvement in World War II. His most famous speech, titled Century of the Common Man, saw the VP phrasing the then global climate as a fight between a slave world and a free world. His efforts on foreign affairs saw him become accustomed to Latin culture while also being a member of the Top Policy Group, which proposed the creation of a nuclear weapons program. Despite having the support of 65% of Democrats at the time of the 1944 convention, Wallace was kicked off the ticket. Due to Roosevelt's health clearly on the decline, many were worried that Henry Wallace, who supported racial desegregation in the South and supported conciliatory policies towards the Soviet Union, would become the next commander-in-chief if Roosevelt died. Although Roosevelt remarked he would vote for Wallace had he been a delegate, Wallace was toppled and replaced with the little-known anti-communist moderate Harry Truman. Within 82 days of starting his fourth term, Roosevelt passed away and Truman became the new president, a move which would have huge implications for global affairs for the rest of the 21st century. Wallace became Secretary of Commerce after Roosevelt's re-election but was soon booted out of the cabinet by Truman. As a result, Wallace resurrected the Progressive Party and ran for president in 1948, coming in fourth place with 2.4% of the popular vote. Spiro Agnew. A relatively unknown governor of Maryland, Spiro Agnew was not Nixon's first choice for VP and vice versa. Going into the 1968 Republican Convention, Agnew served as chairman of the Rockefeller for President's Citizens Committee, which supported the more liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller. Nonetheless, Spiro was a strategical pick to appease the more conservative wing of the party, including his strong law and order record after his declared state of emergency and use of the National Guard after widespread rioting in Baltimore. Despite this, he still had some level of African American support with a strong civil rights record, including in areas like housing. It was thought these areas could aid Republicans to carry states in the Deep South that may otherwise fall to third-party segregationist George Wallace. After Nixon triumphed in 1968, Agnew became the highest-ranking Greek American in U.S. history. During his tenure, Agnew was kept at arm's length of the White House even as early as 1970. Nixon hatched plans to get rid of Agnew by placing him on the Supreme Court and replacing him with John Connally. In the end, Nixon kept Agnew during his 1972 re-election campaign, needing to appease the conservative Republican wing after upsetting them with his détente policies towards China and the Soviet Union. Although escaping unscathed from the Watergate scandal, Agnew faced an insurmountable career killer in 1973. The District Attorney of Maryland had investigated Agnew on several counts, finding evidence of real estate kickbacks since 1962, including as county executive, governor of Maryland, and even as vice president. After pleading no contest to a charge of tax evasion, he resigned in October of 1973. He would eventually be ordered to pay $1,000 and sentenced to a suspended 3-year sentence. He later be disbarred and would pay $268,000 reimbursement to the state. Nixon announced his replacement as House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, whom Nixon had offered the vice presidency to in 1968, but Ford turned it down with hopes of becoming the next Speaker of the House. Nelson Rockefeller. Technically, this was more of a what would have been replacement scenario, but nonetheless, the president in question ran for re-election having ditched his previous VP. Not long after his time as vice president began, Ford was elevated to the presidency when Nixon became the only president to ever resign, and President Ford became the only person to become VP and then president despite not being elected to either post. Ford considered a few names to become VP, such as Senator Howard Baker, United States Ambassador to NATO Donald Rumsfeld, and Republican National Committee Chairman George H.W. Bush. Ultimately, it was liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller who got the job after 4 months of congressional hearings over his $178 million fortune and his habit of presenting donations and gifts given to close allies as well as officials. His nomination dismayed many of the more conservative Republicans, whilst organizations such as the American Conservative Union opposed the move. Nonetheless, Rockefeller was elected 90-7 in the Senate and 287-128 in the House. Many Democrats supported the nomination, as did the majority of Republicans, although some hardliners objected, such as former Republican nominee Barry Goldwater, who Rockefeller refused to endorse in 1964. Rockefeller's tenure as VP saw infighting between him and members of Ford's staff while also being left in the dark on important matters. This and his unwavering support for the Vietnam War and an infamous photo of him giving hecklers the middle finger on the campaign trail saw Nelson getting a more than 50% disapproval rating, and 25% of Republicans said they would not vote for the GOP had Ford kept Rockefeller on the ticket. In light of these numbers and facing a stiff primary challenge from former California Governor Ronald Reagan, President Ford solemnly told his VP to consider standing down, which Rockefeller conceded to do in late 1975. Ford would later say, "I was very sad because I could not find the words to express the depth of my feeling for him. I was angry with myself for showing cowardice in not saying to the ultra-conservatives, it's going to be Ford and Rockefeller, whatever the consequences." In his place, Ford chose Kansas Senator Bob Dole as his running mate due to Dole being liked by the party's conservative wing. Even had Rockefeller stayed on the ticket and somehow won, Rockefeller wouldn't have completed his term as he passed away in 1979 during an intimate moment with a young aide, leading to the famous New York Magazine quip, "He thought he was coming but he was going." And that's our list. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and share this video around as it helps us to grow the channel. Also make sure to hit the notifications bell, so you never miss another one of our videos.